Okay, just finished all that. This thing wants to do a restart on my computer. I'll do it later. Anyway, it is still too bright. But hello and welcome to the Streaming Parson Reads the Book of Samuel. And yes, I know it's been a little bit of a while since I did the last reading, but I am back today. And since it has been a little bit of a while since I did my last reading, I might as well just kind of get you caught up from where we were last time. So last time, I was reading through the Book of Samuel. I was doing the whole arc where Israel asked the prophet Samuel for a king, because I guess the people were dissatisfied with how things were going. You know, between like Eli's sons beforehand were pretty corrupt and messed up a lot of the clerical life of Israel, and of course, you know, Samuel's own sons weren't that much better. And of course, there's the whole thing where there's a deeper problem of human beings wanting something else or something more, you can even call it that, than what God was offering the people, right? So that's kind of where we left off. And then, of course, as the story builds up, we are shown the first king of Israel, a dude named Saul, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, right? And he becomes the first king of Israel. And then I ended last week's, or 2 weeks ago, sorry, I finished the last reading anyway, where Saul is officially coronated as king of Israel after he has like an epic win against the Ammonites in a fight. He has a pretty badass win there, and then he's officially coronated as king. With that being said, I think that kind of gets us up to speed. I'll still do a bit of a preface, but I know it has been a while since I did the last reading stream, so I just wanted to make sure that I kind of, you know, just did a quick overview of what happened last time, 2 weeks ago. With that said, though, we're going to start off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll begin reading, you know, the book of Samuel. We'll be starting at chapter 12 today, and I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV, if you want to follow along. But let's just take a quick word of prayer as I give you time to flip or click into, you know, 1 Samuel. Lord God, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And first, I just want to make a special, you know, prayer in regard to the conflict between Israel and Palestine and all that craziness that's going on there. And Lord, I just pray that you would bring a peaceful resolution to this. You know, that there are things more important than, you know, territory and land, but I pray that people would have their sights on you and your desire for us to live in peace and for us to love one another. And that we would realize that since that is your desire for us, that we should pursue goodness and peace. And I pray that this Israel-Palestine conflict would, you know, come to an end. Lord, I just pray for all the innocent lives that have been taken. Just pray that there would be mercy, because, you know, we speak against the evil that was done to them, and our hearts mourn for those who have suffered because of the evil that caused this fighting in the first place. And I pray that in the midst of that people would know that you desire mercy, from all of us. And that would be a reminder that would be spoken to all the people that are fighting in Israel. And that there would be peace. And not just, a ceasefire, but the kind of peace where you give us life and harmony with one another. Real peace. I just pray as we read through the book of Samuel that you would really reveal in our hearts that how important it is to know that it is only in you that we have our trust, and only you can be the king of our lives. I pray that this would be a reality in us all. And I pray that as we read through the book of Samuel, that would be more eye-opening to us. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Anyway, I'm going to put the screen away so that it's not as glowy. Okay, so my quick preface before we actually start reading. I better make sure I didn't leave voice chat on. Okay, didn't want someone popping in, interrupting. Anyway, you guys can use the chat to ask questions, right? Because I just don't want to have a conflict of voices, especially when I don't have the headset on. And then the microphone might be, it's sensitive. My microphone is pretty sensitive, so if noise came through my speaker and then back into the microphone, it makes a feedback basically. Anyway, so one of the important things to understand as we're reading through the book of Samuel is that the main focus of the book of Samuel is to be reminded of an important revelation that God gave. Well, I mean, technically, he kind of always had given this with Moses, but with the Torah, it was more implied, right? And it was you think of the Ten Commandments, right? It was kind of implied of when God how he relates himself to the people, right? In the first commandment, I am the Lord your God who freed you from the land of Egypt. It's implied that God is to be the king of the Israelites, right? That he was to be their leader and all that, right? It was in the Ten Commandments, it's more implied. But with Samuel, in the book of Samuel, God is much more explicit with it, right? When he tells Samuel, it was not you that the people rejected, but it was I as their king that they rejected, seeking an earthly king like every other nation, right? This is referring back to, this is my paraphrase or my abridge of 1 Samuel 8. So, with the Israelites rejecting God as their king and Samuel giving them an earthly king, the Bible has a grand kind of theme behind the rest of the story, right? So the story plays out, and the story plays out on the very human level, right? But on the spiritual level, the way you're supposed to think of the story is that God is reminding us that it is only in God that we can ultimately trust, right? And part of that means that we view God as our king, right? Or our ruler, or, our prime leader, if you will, right? Whatever you want to call it. King is the easy word for it, right? Because, of course, king has other implications, right? There's a dynastic thing, and that's where Jesus comes in and all that stuff, right? With the whole, Son of Man thing, and then, the glorification from the Father, blah, 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 right? All those Book of Daniel enthusiasts, right? So anyways, the overall background theme that's playing out, though, is a reminder to the people that only God can be king. And so how the Bible does this is to tell us a story of bad kings. All right. Now, my hot take in this whole book of Samuel, I know some people might get a little on edge about this, but as we read, if you read through the Bible, not to, I know it sounds mean when I say it that way because now it sounds like I'm insulting your intelligence, but as we read through the Bible, you'll actually see that David is not that great a king either, right? For different reasons, right? But that doesn't change that David did a lot of things wrong. He had failed miserably on certain important areas of the kingship of Israel. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a reminder that only God can be king, because no human can do it, right? Even, a better human, right? Because Saul's a pretty bad king. He fails quite miserably. And then David starts off well, but he also fails, right? But it's not so much that, like, well, they're all bad kings because they're all evil people, because that's not true either, right? Saul and David are not bad because they're malicious kings, right? Because if you read through the book of Kings, we actually get some really bad guys, like evil people as kings, right? But Saul and David aren't so much on this malicious level. Although Saul kind of has a downward spiral because of his jealousy toward David, but that's a different thing that we will eventually talk about as we read through the book of Samuel. But more importantly, what the Bible does say is that no human being can ever fulfill the kingly role in our lives, right? Only God can do that. And so the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the reason why there's that divide, and I've mentioned this before, I tend to treat them as if they're one book. And the reason why 1st and 2nd Samuel are one book is because if we keep the main thesis of only God can be king, and the revelation that's given to Samuel, which is why it's called the book of Samuel, not the book of Saul and the book of David, right? But rather it's called the book of Samuel because both 1st and 2nd Samuel primarily focus on the revelation that God gave to Samuel that only he can be king, right? Now, of course, by the end of the book of Samuel, 2nd Samuel, God puts a little bit of hope despite, the failings of David, about how even though, humans have messed up and human leadership will never be good enough, right? Because only God can do that, right? God still uses David to carry out a bigger plan, right? And he uses the line of David for a bigger plan, right? Yes, God can do that, but that doesn't change the idea. That doesn't say, well, the ends justify the means, right? They can't say that well, David isn't a bad king then because God is going to use his line for, Jesus and all that. That's not a real argument, right? But the reality is that only God can be king, and no human being can do it. And so, as we continue through 1 Samuel, last time we had the start of Saul's career, and he actually starts off pretty good, right? He starts off pretty well in that, he prophesies, and there's a saying about how, oh, is Saul also a prophet? Is he among the prophets? Because, the Spirit of God comes strongly upon Saul, and he changes his attitude toward, being a passive, thinking he's too small and being a passive person, and actually being a leader, right? But of course, Saul, like anyone else, will have his moral failings because nobody's perfect, right? No human being is perfect, and that's why no human being can ultimately be king. But with that being said, right, we're going to read through more of the story of Saul and seeing how the first king of Israel couldn't cut it, right? And it was a reminder to the Israelites, and by extension to us today, that no human leader will ever be good enough, right? Or I guess I'm jumping ahead there. That's kind of the way you should view David when we get there. No human king will ever be good enough. The way we should view Saul's story is that This is what happens. Saul is what happens when you want to be like all the other nations, when you just want human king to do things for you, right? And the danger that poses, because how's the old saying go, right? Power corrupts. And so Saul is a prime example of that. He's a guy that's like, he starts off as a good guy, he wants to do right, but power corrupts, and Saul becomes pretty corrupt because he gets high on the power, right? And so that's the way you should view Saul's failing, right? He's not like this malicious king like some other kings we read about that are actually really awful. But Saul is the indicative example of that old saying, power corrupts, right? And, Saul does have a little bit of a power trip, which is what gets him in trouble. So let's read about that. So I'm going to start chapter 12, which is technically a continuation of chapter 11. So I'll read the last part of chapter 11. I'll read from chapter 11, verse 12, and then continue on through chapter 12, because I think starting from chapter 11, verse 12, gives you that like backdrop to how you should read chapter 12. Oh boy, that's a lot of talking without actually reading, so let's just dive into this. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us? Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death.'" And now it's been a while since I've done the reading because I forgot what voice I gave Saul. Then Saul said to the people, Saul said, "No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." That's the voice he's having now. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. And there they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord. And Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. Now Samuel said to all of Israel, "I have listened to everything you said to me, and have set a king before you. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray, and my sons are here with you. I have been your leader since my youth until this day. Now here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I have done any of these things, I will make it right." "You have not cheated or oppressed us," they replied. "You have not taken anything from anyone's hand." So Samuel said to them, "The Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand." "He is witness," they said. Then Samuel said to the people, "It is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your ancestors out of Egypt. Now, stand here, because I am going to confront you with the evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your ancestors." So after Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, the commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who had fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, "We have sinned. We have forgotten the Lord and served the Baals and Ashtoreths. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you." Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel. and he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you, so that you lived in safety. But when you saw Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, 'No, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king.' Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, and do not rebel against his commands, if both you and this king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, and his hand will be against you, as it was against your ancestors. Now then, stand still, and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. It is not wheat harvest, is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king." Then Samuel called out on the Lord, and the same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. The people all said to Samuel, "Pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we will not die. We have added to all our other sins of evil for asking of a king." "Do not be afraid," Samuel replied. "You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish." I don't know how long I was going to keep that up, but that is chapter 12. So what can be said about chapter 12? So basically chapter 12... Oh, I'm just going to grab something here. I forgot to plug this in. I'll plug in my phone here for a minute. Anyway, so chapter 12. Basically, Samuel is kind of calling out the people and telling them, hey, you've sinned against God by basically disregarding him as your king, basically. And it's a big deal, right? Because the people were supposed to remember that God is their king. No human king can ever fulfill that role, right? And I mean, you think about going back to you go back to the Ten Commandments, and that violates rule 2, right? Do not put other gods before God, right? Do not make idols for yourself. And yes, that includes other human beings. Go figure. And so Samuel's pointing this. The whole point of his speech is that he's pointing this out to the Israelites, right? He's pointing out that, like, yeah, you've committed idolatry, basically. But God's willing to be merciful. He's not going to punish you too much. From here on out, just obey God, and you'll be fine, right? And so that's kind of the whole shtick of chapter 12. Not much else needs to be said, because aside from that, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? And after Samuel calls out the people, the people realize that, like, yeah, we kind of made a mistake, right? We didn't trust God enough, and that's so true in the world today, right? The way that we try and view how, our how we live our lives, right? We hope someone else will take charge, right, and take care of us, as opposed to, trusting in God and seeking God's way and all of that, right? Instead of seeking God's will, we tend to appoint other people to make decisions for us, right? Because yes, it is true that, like, deciding for yourself can be scary, but that doesn't mean you just, like, you know go to someone else and have them do it for you, because then that person will just take advantage of you, right? That's kind of a duh. But that's where we run to, the problems that we do, because we're scared of having to take charge in our lives, and we appoint leaders to do that. And an easy example is, like, governments. Now, of course, we need structure. That's true. We need structure of, like, how to run a society. But at the same time, you can't over rely on people, because, well, just if you're introspective, you look at yourself and be like, okay, I am not the most trustworthy human being, right? Most of us can be honest about that. Like, we know we are not the most trustworthy people, right? If you look at yourself, and you could probably think, like, yeah, I'm not the most trustworthy person, right? I'm not the best human being on the planet, right? I'm actually kind of terrible. And then if you think about it hard enough, it's like, well, people that are not that different, we're appointing them into office and stuff like that, right? Now, on the one hand, that's also why we should be graceful when people make mistakes, right? Because, you know, we can be empathetic and sympathetic where, leaders have their shortcomings and their failings, and it's like, yeah, if that were me, I probably would have screwed up too in some way, right? And this is kind of one of the things Jesus talks about when he says, like, don't be so quick to judge people, right? Not because judging in itself is wrong, but the idea that people can look down on other people, say, like, holding this moral high ground, as opposed to being realistic and saying, like, well, if it were me, I probably would have made similar mistakes. And so that's why we should be compassionate, right? When we see people with their moral failings, we should be compassionate, because we're not that different, right? That's all true. And so that's the more reason that, like, well, what can be done, right? Well, that's why we got to seek out God. And we should be realistic about that. And so, you think of, like, the world today and our current government systems, and it's so easy to just, like, crap on all the bad things going on in it, let's just say, right? And this has been a trend for a while, right? I mean, it's kind of what happens when we forsake God in our culture. Then every leader looks bad, because then you appoint godless leaders, and then they do bad things, and then that really breaks the people's trust, and then people are like, well, what, we should just have no leader, blah 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 blah, right? But then, of course, if that were to happen, you would just have anarchy, right? Because then you have a power vacuum, and then, like, that doesn't go very well, and it's tough. But at the same time, the thing that we need to be honest about is that we know human beings can never get the job done when it comes to doing what's right and doing what is good for, society as a whole, for people as a whole, right? You can't trust people. It's just the way it is, right? And so that's, as I would say it, that's all the more reason we need to seek God and ask God for guidance, and of course have God be the ultimate ruler of our lives, because then, God knows what he's doing, right? So I mean, that's the big contrast, right? Human beings, we have no idea what we're doing, but God knows what He's doing, right? And so that's that's the thing we have to face, right? And it's not an easy thing to face. Of course it isn't. But at the same time, we've lived. Those of you that have lived long enough, you can look at the world around you and see, like, yeah, clearly this isn't working, right? And so now I know some of you are probably like all cautious, like, is this guy promoting the idea of a theocracy? Which, I mean, I suppose on the grand scheme of things, you could say that, right? Because, yeah, God being our king, that's a fundamental idea as the Bible gives since the get-go, more or less, right? At least, especially starting the book of Exodus, for sure. I think in Genesis, that's a little downplayed. God doesn't play that role of being the king of humanity so much. He definitely plays it up when he, in Exodus, and of course, the reason for that is also a contrast with, like, well, human kings like Pharaoh, right? But and then that continues on, right, to Revelation, right? That at the end, Jesus is the ultimate king, and he takes his throne at the very end, and the New Jerusalem and all that, right? So, I mean, I suppose you could say that, like, yes, I am kind of promoting a theocracy, if you will, but you know, at the same time, I mean, who else other than Jesus Christ, right? I mean, who else, right? Because as Jesus displays, that only he has the authority of life and death, right? And I would go with a guy who has that kind of authority, right? As opposed to human beings, we are, you know, the emperor with no clothes, right? It's ironic that we word it that way, but I think that's where we get that phrasing in that story, right? The emperor has no clothes idea. That was a long tirade for chapter 12, which was actually pretty short. But now Israel has entered a new chapter of their history, right? Now they've entered the age of kings. Well, it's pretty early in it because, Saul is the first king and they just kind of started that, right? But of course, another thing that we'll also see, with that being said anyway, is that once again, this is all the more reason that, like, only God can be king, because even though they got a human king, just like all the other nations, things don't change that much, right? People live in their sin. People just do whatever they want, and then that goes awry. It doesn't really change anything, right? Because fundamentally, if you're not obeying God, you're not following God, you're going to run into your problems, right? Not saying that, like, when you follow God, all your problems are perfectly solved. That's not true either in this life, right? That's just the way it is. But the idea that I'm suggesting is that, like, things were not that different. Things don't change much because fundamentally, at a heart level, whether there's a human king or not, if you rebel against God in your heart, you got problem, right? And you have conflict with God. That's just the way it is, right? That's not going to change just because you have a human king, right? And a human king cannot fight that battle, your personal battle with God, right? A human king can't do that either, right? And so, with that being said, nothing really changes, right? People are still awful, right? Think of it like this way, right? Like, when you have people committing crime in your neighborhood, does changing from a Democrat to a Republic government change that there's going to be crime in your neighborhood? Not really, right? If not at all, right? The problem is not what government you have. The problem is people as individuals need to stop committing crime. That's kind of the idea, right? So in the same way, as we read through the Bible, well, of course things don't change much when there's a king, right? People commit sin and people live in their sin. Getting a human king changes nothing, right? You can't. if people want to live their sinful lives and continue living that way, no human authority is going to change that, right? That's just a matter of fact. And this is, my hot. Okay, ready for the hot take now? Okay, so the hot take I have is that, like, when we look at, like, all this stuff that's wrong in the world today, right? And people think, like, well, changing our government systems, and down with this and up with this and whatever, right? And we've come with so many different human systems, and not that the idea in themselves are not bad things, right? It's we try to fix what's going on in our world because there's a lot of injustice. There's a lot of evil in the world we live in. But, we can come up with whatever ideas we want. But the fact of the matter is, no human idea will ever succeed. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is, right? We've got to be realistic. We've been trying this for, like, at least 10,000 years, and it's still, we haven't made much progress, right? If people don't change on that fundamental level, that spiritual level, no amount of human governments, no amount of human systems will ever fix the problem, right? You think of, like, this is we're gonna go there, right? You think of, like, stuff like the racism problems in the U.S., right? The government system, having the government just, like, create these quote unquote laws, you can call them that. They're more like people charging you for, like, forms of assault and then just expanding it to things like verbal racial slurs kind of thing and stuff like that. But once again, just because you make systems and institutions doesn't change that we as human beings need to change. We need to stop being evil, right? Basically. I know it's a weird way of wording it, but changing the laws won't change that we want to do bad things, right? Only reorienting ourselves toward God will ultimately do that. And even then, like, in this life, that's not going to be a perfect transition. If it will never be fully achieved in this life, right? But of course, this life is meant to make that process that we have made, that we are willing to make those changes ultimately, right? And that's kind of the spirit of repentance, right? That I want to move away from those sinful things, the sinful nature, right? The inner person in us that wants to be racist or, like, thievish or whatever, right? And all the other evil things, violent and malicious, the inner liar and all that, right? Because we all have those things in us. We all have all those vices, right, that live in us, and we're stuck with them in this life because they are part of who we are. But as the whole idea, the Christian idea of repentance is the idea that, like, with the forgiveness of Christ and the blood of Christ, we can move beyond those things, right? Those things won't tie me down forever. And there's hope in that. The hope in the resurrection is that I won't be tied down forever by all my sinful vices, right? Even though I fight against them today, I know I will never fully overcome them. But we look to the future and, the mercy of God and the grace of God and the power of God to move us beyond those things, right? That's kind of the ultimate hope, right? But I think that's the thing that we have to really consider as we, think about what it means. One, to live this life, and two, to obey God and to believe in God, right? That there's a hope we can move beyond. Not through human systems, but through the power of God. All the evil that not just exists in the world around us, but it also exists within us, right? Because after all, how's the old saying go? If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the transient of logic is, since no human system can work, no matter how hard you try and no matter what brilliant ideas you come up with, they're not real solutions. Therefore, everything you come up with is still part of the problem, right? And therefore, since you participate in the systems, you are part of the problem, right? And we are all part of the problem, right? We should all be honest with that. But at the same time, that's all the more reason to like look toward God, because the pessimistic view would just be, or the nihilistic view would be like, then what's the point, right? Nothing ever is gonna work. But that's where the resurrection and the power of God comes into play, right? Because then there is a way beyond the hopelessness of, well, no human system will ever work, right? The God system will work. Of course, it doesn't all come in at once, and that will only come when Jesus returns and gives us the new kingdom and the new Jerusalem and the new earth and all that stuff, right? As we read in the book of Revelation. Only then will that happen. But in this life, we are to have hope in that and to orient our own lives toward, well, what would it be like if I were to be a citizen in the new earth? How should I conduct myself, right? That is how we live this life, right? You prepare yourself for the new life, and you try living your life. You'll never get it perfect right. You'll never get it perfectly right. And anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. But you'll never get it perfectly right. But you're supposed to train yourself in this life and orient yourself toward, how would I live in that new life, right? And I have to make myself the kind of person, right, in the future. Of course, it ain't easy, and all the more reason why we need God's help for it. But that is how we should live, right? And that's how, that is how there will be real change, right? But of course, only God can ultimately do that. Right? That is a mouthful. And that's just chapter 12. Hey, I gotta make up for like the last week I wasn't here, so we gotta have a lot more content, right? Anyway, let's move on to chapter 13. Chapter 13. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. So Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Now Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." I am really inconsistent with this dude's voice. So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Now the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Probably an exaggeration. They were up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Now Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops who were with him were shaking in fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. Now just as he was finishing the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. And Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's commandment." Then Samuel left Gilgal, and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin. And Saul counted the men who were with him, and they numbered about 600. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make spears or swords." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 a shekel for sharpening point plows and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand, for only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Alright, so chapter 13. We already see Saul already makes a big mistake. Already does a big goof. A goof up. And so, what happens exactly, right? So, we need to break this down a little bit. So what's happening here is that Saul is he's already kind of got like this point in time, because we assume there's a time skip of some kind, right? Because after all, the Bible says he's like 30 when he becomes king, but then the next story that kind of immediately takes place, at least in the text, is that now Jonathan is an adult, his son, right? We assume he's an adult because, he's fighting in the war as well. I mean, sure, child soldiers was kind of a thing, but I mean, ancient world, everybody, like, I've kind of made this joke, especially when I was playing, like, in Fire Emblem. I made this joke about how, like, the reason why we see child soldiers kind of thing in, like, medieval fantasy games is because, like, in medieval fantasy games, there's this kind of, like, everybody fights to live and lives to fight. And so, like, why is there a priest class, right? In RPGs, right? Aren't priests supposed to be, like, pacifists and stuff? It's like, no, everybody fought, right? That's just how it was in the ancient world, right? I mean, the idea of not everybody had to fight is a much more newer idea, right? That was probably an idea that came out, like, just before the Renaissance, right? But basically all that time before that, ancient world, the Middle Ages or whatever, right? Everybody had to fight, right? So, I mean, we could suggest that Jonathan was fighting when he was a young teenager, but for simplicity's sake, let's just say he's like at youngest 16, probably older than that. He's probably like about 20. Let's say he's about 20. And let's say Saul had him at the age of 20, so Saul might be 40. Because Saul does live a pretty long time, right? After all, the Bible does this thing, and I might as well point this out. one thing that's interesting to point out about the book of Samuel that I didn't point out yet, because this is the first time the book of Samuel will do it. But the book of Samuel will do it again with David. And there's this annoying thing that the Bible does. Well, the book of Samuel, anyway. And it does something that, while we do this normally when we speak, it's really annoying to read. And so, this was, at the beginning of chapter 13, there's this whole shtick about how, like, Saul was 30 when he became king, and he reigned for Israel for 42 years. Now, this is kind of like an annal thing, right? Let's hypothetically say that, like, imagine if someone was, like, reading, like, the story of a great leader, right? I mean, Saul is the first king of Israel. So, we're reading the story of a great king. A modern example would be like, former President Barack Obama was the president of the United States for 2 terms. And during those 2 terms, he did this and he did that. He made these he passed these legislations and fought against these things and da 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 da, right? And so the storytelling would be like, you kind of give the general timescape of someone's importance, at the beginning of the story, right? So if I were to say, like, okay, President Barack Obama was the president for 8 years, and then you tell any story about him being president, but any of those stories happens within those 8 years, right? Because you started off the story with, he was the president for 8 years. And then anything you say about President Barack Obama happens sometime in those 8 years, right? Now, you don't have to say, like, okay, he was the president of the United States for 8 years, and then you tell an event about his life during his presidency. But if you tell a story about him, no one assumes that you're just talking about, like, the very first thing he did, unless you're talking about the first thing he did. But, like, let's say, one day while he was in the White House, this happened, right? We don't know exactly when it happened, but we know it's during those 8 years, right? And time is not really relevant. We just know it was somewhere between, like, 2008 and 2016, right? But, we could talk an event that happened in 2009, or we could be talking about an event that happened in 2015, right? And so, when we tell stories, like oral stories like this, we tend to use, like, oh yeah, there was this guy, he was around doing this thing, right? And we find these things a lot, like, you think of, like, folklore stories. Folklore stories love doing this, right? They talk about, like, well, in this time, during the reign of this king or this dude or whatever, there was this guy named Robin Hood or something, right? You think of, like, any sort of Robin Hood, right? It's just like, well, during the rule of King John, near the town of Nottingham in a place called Sherwood Forest, there was a guy named Robin Hood, and he did this, and Robin Hood was a bandit in Sherwood for, I don't remember how long it was, but once again, the folklore storytelling is used here. And you think of, like, we do this all the time as well, right? When you're like, okay, so you're telling a story about, like, well, my day was like this. And then you tell an event during the day. And then you tell another event during the day. You might not even have told the 2 events in order, right? Although it would make sense if we told it in order, but let's say, like, let me do a better example. So let's say, like, you're telling a story about, like, my day at work was rough. And damn, it was rough because, like, all of these things happened, right? Like, nothing was going right. We didn't have all the right supplies. All our gear is starting to break down. The kitchen staff at the place I work at always gets in the damn way, blah, 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 right? But even before that, my day was already rough because waking up super early sucks. And then, traffic was not fun to deal with in the morning. So, in that example I just gave, I told my workday story, and then I jumped to a point earlier in the story, right? Before the story actually takes place. Because I'm not really treating time like it matters in my storytelling, right? The general idea that you're supposed to get from my little work story there is that my day at work was rough, right? And if I use other factors, whether they happen before or after, right? Time is not really relevant. The thing you're supposed to get is that, like, okay, Michael's workday was terrible, right? In the same way, the Bible does this, especially the book of Samuel. And this leads a lot of a popular opinion that the earliest versions of the book of Samuel. Now, I talk about how, like, the prophet Nathan wrote the book. But of course, just because he wrote the book doesn't mean, like, everybody had a copy of the book. So everybody would tell stories, right? And once again, what we have in our modern text, excuse me, is a, what do you call it? It's a recording that takes place way later, right? So once again, I mentioned this in the book of Genesis reading. I mentioned the book of Exodus reading. And I'll mention it again. So we know for a fact that basically the version of the Bible that we have, at least the Old Testament for sure, was most likely compiled during the time of the rebuilding of the temple, roughly 680 BC, sorry, 600 BC, not 80, no. Roughly 600 BC, right, after the Babylonian exile for 70 years. And then, of course, in the book of Ezra, it's implied that, they had compiled all the manuscripts and everything that they knew about the scriptures, and they compiled it all together and then created the Bible, right? And so, well, the Old Testament anyway. So, with that being said, perhaps some of the wording that was in the book of Samuel may have been stuff developed during the 70 years, during the Babylonian exile, as people would tell stories, the Bible stories, right? And they would tell them to each other. And perhaps the book of Samuel, when people told the story, they adopted, a more modern storytelling formula. And so, which makes sense, right? There's no reason why you wouldn't do that. And every culture has their own version of this problem, right? And it's one of those things where, like, as I said earlier, it's one of those things that we do all the time when we speak, but it's actually annoying to read. And the reason why that is like, when you're telling a story to your friends, right? People can quickly grab the idea when you're just giving words about, like, okay, my workday was rough, and then this, and that happened, right? And it doesn't have to be in any real order. But people get the idea, right? When you're telling them the story, they can tell through your tone, your emotion in the story, etc., etc. This is why oral storytelling is so important, right? And that's why it will never be a dying art, right? Now, when it comes to text, though, you can't quite convey it the same way. And with text, the cues are not as obvious when, like, you're jumping through time events, right? So we go back with the beginning of chapter 13, talking about, like, Saul was king for 42 years, right? And then it tells a story about, him in this, he's going to battle, and he makes a mistake before the battle even begins, right? The Bible isn't so concerned about when this happened. All we know is that there was a time skip because his son Jonathan is older now. He's not a little kid anymore, so he's because he's able to fight. So Saul's older. He's not like, it's not like, well, Saul became king when he was 30. When he was 32, this happened. We don't know that, right? He could be a lot older. And it makes more sense that he could be. Of course, one of the problems we run into is, well, Saul could have been a pretty good king for the early years, right? And it's more than likely that he was. And there's actually hints that he was actually a pretty good guy in his earlier years. But now, I know, of course, take this with a grain of salt, and I know some people may have, like, knee-jerk reactions about this. But once again, the book of Samuel's main theme is to remind us that only God can be king. So yes, even though Saul may have had some good early years, what the Bible is primarily focused on is pointing out where Saul went wrong, because no human being can replace God as king. And so what the Bible does here in chapter 13, telling the story where Saul acts on his own accord without obeying God, that's what the Bible wants to focus on, right? The Bible wants to point out where Saul failed because it's supposed to remind us that only God can be king. The Bible is preoccupied with that. The book of Samuel is preoccupied with that idea. So, when this story begins, even though, like, okay, Saul was king for 42 years, and we don't see most of those 42 years, and of course, on top of that, the Bible begins with the beginning of his downfall. It does not tell us a bunch of good things he might have done, because once again, the Bible is not preoccupied with that. It wants to remind us only God can be king, so it tells us where Saul begins to fail. Now you're wondering, how is Saul failing in this story? I mean, you're probably not wondering, because Samuel does kind of say it flat out, right? That, Saul had not lived up to the commandments of God. But I think there's much more subtler details that the Bible kind of implies when Samuel says that. And you have to look at the scene that plays out as well, right? So what's the scene? The scene is basically Saul and his buddies, his army, they're going to go fight some Philistines, right? And the Bible tells you that, like, well, Saul was supposed to wait for Samuel, and Samuel's supposed to, like, give a prayer or something, a pre-fight prayer. Sounds funny when you say that out loud, but that's what he was going to do. So Samuel was supposed to give a pre-fight prayer. But instead of waiting, Saul decides to do it himself, right? He does a burnt sacrifice, and he does it himself. And then Samuel shows up and goes, yo, man, what the hell, right? Like, you're supposed to wait for me. And of course, like, Saul gives a pretty rational excuse, right? He's like, well, the men were all scared, and they weren't sure you're going to show, whatever, right? And the Philistines are ready to fight us. What do we do, right? We didn't know if we had enough time. It was a rational response, I'm sure, but at the same time, what the Bible's preoccupied with is to say that, like, no, we listen to God's commands, and we follow, we obey God, right? And you can't just excuse your way out of disobedience, right? And so that's kind of what happens here, right? Now, on the surface, it seems pretty innocent, right? That, well, Saul just got worried that things were going to get tight, and so he had to act. And, that's how many people think of justifying their rash behaviors, right? I had to act now, right? But there's actually something a lot deeper going on, which goes back to the whole theme that only God can be king. Now think about this for a moment. In the ancient system that they had, right? They had, priests, prophets, kings, whatever, right? And everybody had their place in their social class, right? But for the most part, when you are in your social class, you do not move out of your social class, right? Which I know is an older idea, and we as moderns may scoff at the idea of, like, what? People are stuck within their place in life? Well, part of the, Jewish religion was that only Levites can perform the temple sacred rites, right? All the sacrifices, offerings, and stuff like that. That was the Levites' job, right? God had delineated that to the Levites. But Saul is not a Levite, right? So what right does he have to do something like the burnt offering, right? That's kind of what's going on here, right? Because Saul does it himself. He doesn't wait for Samuel to do it. And so that's where Saul starts overstepping his boundaries. Now, once again, we run into the problem that, like, since we don't see every moment of Saul's life, you don't get to see where that power gets to his head, right? For how long he was king. But since we can assume that he's been king for a while, because once again, Jonathan has grown up now, we don't exactly see the slow process of when Saul gets that power corruption, right? Where he gets his power trip, if you will. But what the Bible does tell us is that that does happen to him eventually. It did happen to him. And that's what we see in chapter 13. That he's already having a bit of that power trip in him, right? That he thinks he can just do all the rights, right? Because he's king and he's been king for a while. And sure, he may have done a good job in the past, but that's gone to his head. And he thinks, well, I can do whatever now, right? I'm in charge. So that's where, Saul is acting rashly. And this is not the only time he does this, right? He'll do rash things because he's kind of like, well, I can just do whatever I want, right? I can say what I want and whatever. Sounds like certain, recent world leaders, right? And Saul is no different, and people today are no different, right? But once again, it's kind of a case in point of why only God can be king, right? Because all human beings will fall into the same problem that Saul had, right? And it would be foolish to think that if you were in charge, you would be any different, because, all of us are simple-minded people, and power will corrupt us if you've been in it for a while, right? But that's where Saul goes wrong, right? The Bible does this like major time jump, and it doesn't care to show us all the parts he did right, but it wanted to really point out where he starts going wrong with his power trip. And then, of course, the next couple of chapters will tell us more instances of Saul just kind of doing whatever he wants, because he because he's been king for a while, he can just say whatever he wants, and that's going to get him in trouble, right? Running his mouth, Saul runs his mouth way too much. I mean, you think I run my mouth a lot, but damn, like Saul runs his mouth and gets himself in trouble. Kind of sounds like certain recent people, but to not get myself in trouble with YouTube, I won't say it. I won't say it outright, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. Anyway, continuing on through the rest of chapter 13, kind of tells this funny story about how like the Israelite people were fighting the Philistines with like basically farmer tools, because for some reason nobody has weapons. Why the Bible bothers to tell us this part of the story is, I don't really think it matters that much. I mean, I think it means something in the next chapter, but it's more implied than anything. It's not like, oh yeah, there was a miracle of God that they won with farming tools, right? It's just kind of like, okay, this happened, and it kind of matters for the next chapter, so that's where we're going next. Chapter 14 is where we're going next. Now a detachment of the Philistines had gone out to the pass of Michmash. Now one day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, I need a voice for this guy. I'm trying to think of a good voice for this guy. Should I do a shameless plug-in advertising for one of my other videos and one of the other voices I do? Because this is a fun voice that I like doing in my Bravely Default playthrough, and I'm going to use this voice. Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. If you know the voice, if you know what voice I'm using, hit that like button. But he did not tell his father. So Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. Now with him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah. Ahijah? I don't know if the J is supposed to be silent here. I'm going to say Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. Now he was the son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli. So that would make him Eli's grandson? Great-grandson. Eli's great-grandson. the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. Sorry for the interruption. There you go. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. Now on each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez, and the other Sina. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, and the other to the south toward Geba. Now Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let us go over to the outposts of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord by saving, whether by many or by few." And now I gotta have a voice for this guy. I'm gonna do a simple one because it only has like a couple lines. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul. So Jonathan said, Come on then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, Wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, Come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outposts. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, Come up to us, and we will teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Now Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, and with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor-bearer, followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer, killed some 20 men in an area in about half an acre. So basically they were just like two guys kicking ass. Then the panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Now Saul's outlooks at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, Muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor-bearer who were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, Bring the ark of God, for at the time it was still with Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, Withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. Verse 24. This is a longer chapter. Now the Israelites were in distress that day, because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on the enemies. So none of the troops had tasted food. Now the entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with an oath. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, Cursed be anyone who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. Jonathan said, My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brighten when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would be if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? So that day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted, and they pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them, together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, Go out among the men and tell them, Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep, and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord, and it was the first time he had done this. Now Saul said, Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night, and plunder them until dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive. Do whatever seems best to you, the people replied. But the priest said, Let us inquire of God first. So Saul asked God, Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. So Saul therefore said, Come here, all of you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies within my son Jonathan, he must die. But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, You stand over there. I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel. Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. And Saul said, Cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, Tell me, what have you done? So Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die. And Saul said, May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. But the men said to Saul, Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, kings of Zobah, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hand of those who plundered them. Now Saul's sons were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his older daughter was Merab, and that of the younger was Michal. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle, so basically his cousin. Saul's father Kish and Abner's father Ner were sons of Abiel. Now all the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service, as any king would conscript useful fighters. Alright, what do you want? Stop interrupting. Okay, so chapter 14. A lot of stuff here. A lot of ground to cover. So in chapter 14, we have two main events that happen. Right? First, we have Jonathan being awesome. And then, of course, we have Saul being a brash idiot. So that's kind of the two things that kind of happen in this chapter. So the first part of the chapter is basically the story of Jonathan just being awesome, right? So we're introduced to Jonathan, Saul's son, and we assume he's an adult at this point. So Saul's been king for a while, and he's been fighting the, Philistines and a whole bunch of other people for a number of years. And of course, the Bible does paint that Saul was doing a good job. He was inflicting pain on the enemies of Israel for years. And so, where does he go wrong, you're wondering, right? Well, that's the second half of the chapter. But before we get to that, let's just, go beat by beat with Jonathan's little story that happens before. So, I think the main reason of why the Bible keeps this part in, right, this whole little story of Jonathan, is to kind of show how great a guy Jonathan is. Jonathan is kind of this, he would be the kind of guy that, would make a good successor to Saul. Even though, Saul is starting to get a little corrupt. He's getting a little cocky in his position. But Jonathan seems like a pretty stand-up guy, right? Jonathan's a stand-up guy. He's a really good guy, right? And so Jonathan is shown as, in contrast to Saul in chapter 13, Jonathan, he seems like a guy who gets his wisdom from God, right? And he's, there's this moment where, him and his armor bearer are going to go fight these guys, right? And they're like, yo, we're going to go up to this area here and check out this Philistine outpost. And basically he's saying, well, if they want us to leave, we'll just leave. But if they want us to fight them, we'll fight them because God will deliver them into our hands, right? Which is a pretty bold statement, right? No one normally would think that. But, part of it might be Jonathan's confident in his fighting abilities. After all, the Bible does say he's pretty good at it. And then the armor bearer is kind of shown to be a faithful servant, right? He's like, yeah, whatever you say, we'll do, right? And so the story just kind of tells us, event that just happens, right? So Jonathan goes up to this place, and these Philistines, they see these two Hebrews, and they're like, who do you think you are? Just walking up to our post, right? Why don't you come over here so we can kick your ass? Which sounds like the most ridiculous thing, right? No one will ever accept that invitation normally, right? Which then makes you beg the question. Okay, so let's look at it this way. Imagine if you're one of these Philistines, right? There's over 20 of them. Because we know 20 of them get killed. So there's over 20 of these guys just hanging out here, right? And, you taunt these two guys that show up, right? And you're like, haha, you little crap, why don't you come, if you come here, we'll kick your ass, right? Now, if there's 20 of you and 2 of them, right?
you expect them to just cower away and you would laugh at them, right? But then now these two guys start coming toward you. Now, I wonder if any of the Philistines probably clicked that maybe it's not a good idea, that maybe we shouldn't stay, right? If these two guys are actually going to take us on our dare to fight 20 of us, maybe we shouldn't actually keep up with this dare because this seems like a bad idea. These two guys are actually coming toward us. I mean, one, in the ancient world, you would, and I mean, you think of warfare in general, you might think, oh, wait, if, if they're coming to us, there might be more guys around. This could be an ambush, right? They might actually have an ambush ready if these two guys actually come toward us and we meet them, right? There could be more guys around ready to arch or snipe us or something, right? And so I don't know why they didn't think that was a possibility, let alone maybe these two guys are like gods or something, right? Because ancient world thinking that gods were like there were like people of myth were like real thing, like superhumans were around, right? And the Philistines should be aware of this because, of course, we'll read in a few chapters of like Goliath, right? So if two guys start coming toward you, and you're a group of 20 guys, right? And it's just kind of one of those things that, like, I don't know if this is the kind of things that like nerdy people like me think about too much. But like, when the two Philistine or the 20 Philistine guys think like maybe this is a bad idea, maybe we should run for it because this might be an ambush, or we could be dealing with superhumans. Either way, this isn't going to go well for us because normally, if we were taunting two guys, they would just run away from us, right? Because we're the 20, they're the two. But now the two guys are coming toward. Has it? I wonder if it ever crossed their minds. I'm like, maybe we should actually leave. Maybe this is not a good idea. Now and then, of course, like I guess by the power of God, Jonathan and his armor bearer became superhuman that moment and just beat the hell out of these guys, right? It's just one of those funny things where it's like, oh man, we're about to get our asses kicked. And then they do, right? Because Jonathan and his armor bearer just end up like beating the hell out of them. And then the Bible records that like 20 of them died, so there might have been more of them, right? And I don't know, I just thought it was funny because like, oh yeah, it never crossed their minds that like maybe this is a bad idea. Because if two guys look like they're ready to fight, like you because once again, if the expected thing doesn't happen, you should know something's up, right? Because the expected thing would be that the two guys would just run away, right? And you would just laugh at them, right? That's kind of the expected thing. But when the expected thing doesn't happen, you should be wondering what's up with this, right? But the Philistines, I guess, didn't get the memo, so it costed these guys their lives. And then, of course, like the funny thing is, this one skirmish ended up causing like huge tumult among the Philistines, right? Because now they're like all panicking. Oh my goodness, are there like gods running around, right? Slaughtering our people. Which is a funny thing to think about when you read chapter 14 in contrast to like chapter 5, chapter 4 or chapter 5. There's the part with the Ark of the Covenant, right? And the Philistines are like afraid when the Israelites bring the Ark of the Covenant, right? Because they're like, oh my God, there's like a God among them, right? And then, Israel was making a big commotion when they brought the Ark. Well, here in chapter 14, there's kind of this twist, right? And the same scene sort of plays out. Now there's this huge noise among the Philistines, and then the Philistines are like, why are our own people making this noise, right? What's happening? And they're all confused, right? I wonder if they were thinking the same kind of things right? Has the God of the Hebrews come? And I mean, in a way, he does, right? God shows up and gives favor to Jonathan, and then that's why Jonathan, one, beats up 20 guys with relative ease, and two, why the Philistines end up just slaughtering each other. And then Saul and his guys show up and they're like, oh, well, the fight's already over for us. Awesome, let's just plunder, right? But the story itself is just kind of pointing out that like Jonathan is a pretty stand-up guy because one, he's an amazing fighter, and two, he apparently is wise enough to like catch God's signs or something when like he makes that statement about knowing like, oh yeah, if they taunt us to fight them, then we'll do it because we know God is with us, which is not something the average believer would say today, right? I don't think I would walk into like a fight with 20 guys thinking that like, yeah, if they dare me to fight them, I think God is with me and I'm gonna fight 20 guys. Usually not a good idea, right? But who knows? Um, just one of those funny, you know, semi-mythological moments, right? Like this is obviously more than natural. There's a supernatural element to it, which we don't see very common in the world today. I mean, it's not like there isn't sorts of like one-man armies in the world today, but let's just say if I would not be that confident, right? Maybe I don't have enough faith in my life, but it's just the first part of chapter 14 is just like a little story to just tell you how awesome Jonathan is. And yes, Jonathan will come back, and he's a pretty important character in the book of Samuel. So we'll be seeing him again, and you will be hearing more of my fun Elvis voice from Bravely Default 2. My Elvis impersonation for Jonathan's voice, just because I like that voice. It's a fun one to do. Anyway, the second half of chapter 14 though is a very different kind of story, right? Because it goes back to Saul kind of being on a power trip and just doing whatever he wants. So stop me if you heard this one, right? So, Saul is like, yo, we're going to finish these Philistines today. And so I'm going to say that until we kill every last one of them, nobody's eating today. Not a good idea, right? You don't want to starve your troops, which is exactly what he does. And his troops all become hungry. Of course, the Bible tells us Jonathan didn't hear this because he was too busy kicking ass, at a Philistine outpost to know that this oath happened. And so Jonathan obviously breaks the oath, right? Because, he didn't know. But, maybe Saul should have thought this, maybe Saul should not have, said such a brash thing and put his people in such a predicament, right? Because in a way, it's more Saul's fault that the Israelites end up in trouble, right? Because if they have to starve before they can fight, that's not a good way of doing things. Right? That's kind of setting yourself up for failure if you think about it, right? Because it's not easy to fight on an empty stomach, and so Saul, doing this rash oath thing, right? He doesn't think things through because, he probably thinks that he doesn't have to think things through, right? Like everything will just work out. I'm the king, right? But clearly, that ends up not working out for him because his, Jonathan, despite the Bible kind of telling us, just earlier that same chapter, that Jonathan's a pretty stand-up guy and he's pretty awesome. But, he's also the reason why Saul's big plan fails, right? Because Jonathan's too busy just kicking ass, right? But this, of course, gets him in trouble, right? This gets Saul in trouble as well. And, there's other more subtle points being played here that, when Saul is kind of disregarding God's guidance, right? He kind of sets up this oath. And then there's his advisor that's just like, yo, why don't we just ask God what to do, right? Why don't we just do the easy way of doing things, quote unquote, easy way of doing things, and just ask God for help and ask God for guidance, as opposed to like, let's just do this crazy thing, right? Of how to fight the Philistines. Starving ourselves before we fight them sounds like a good plan, because it is not a good plan. Dude, man, like, imagine if, like, I had to, like, hey, let's, like, not sleep before we do the next stream on Monday. Imagine how terrible that stream would go down, because, like, dude, I would be so tired by Monday. if I didn't sleep from now till Monday, I would probably be hallucinating and seeing like gremlins and stuff all over the place, right? If I did not sleep for 3 days. But I mean, if I don't get 8 hours of sleep, I'm yawning in my own Bible reading streams, right? So like, imagine not eating before you have to fight like a whole bunch of guys, right? It doesn't sound like a good plan. Anyway, continuing on, as we go through chapter 14, Saul, he doesn't get the inquiry of God when he actually follows this guy's instruction, like, oh, he asked God and God doesn't answer him. And then Saul's like, yo, what the hell, right? Did someone break the oath of not eating before we defeated the Philistines? And then, of course, he finds out it's his own son, right? And the funny thing about this is, too, is that, like, they cast lots, which is kind of like, basically like, Dungeons and Dragons style, like, rolling dice. Like, all right, if it's these range of numbers, it was the people. If it's this range of numbers, it is me or Jonathan. Right? And of course, like, while they're now, I know some people would say, like, well, that means like everything that happened was by chance. Of course, like on the flip side, you could just say God rigged the dice. Both are true, but like the point is, it's just kind of funny that like a lot of things are decided by lots, which makes it feel like it's by chance, but at the same time, it's not, right? Because there are no accidents, as Master Oogway would say. So, but I don't know. I always thought it was funny that like half the stuff that's decided in the Bible is by casting lots, which is the equivalent of rolling Dungeons and Dragons dice, which I just think is hilarious. And anytime the Bible will mention it, I will always comment and say how funny it is, because it is funny. And so eventually Saul finds out that Jonathan was the one who, broke the oath by eating honey. And I love how, like, when the Bible tells that scene where, like, Jonathan eats the honey and his face lights up and everyone watches him, right? And when, he's basically like, when his face lights up, it's like, honey, delicious, right? Awesome. And everyone else is standing there like, oh God, I'm so hungry. And that's like the worst feeling too. You gotta feel bad for these guys that like we're following Saul, right? Because like, if you ever had that happen, like, you haven't eaten in a while, and then you watch someone just eat something that's really good, and you see that like happiness that they have when they're eating it, and it just makes you feel really terrible, because you're like, I wish that was me right now. And so I just like picture it in my head, all these guys are just watching Jonathan eat this honey, and Jonathan's like, oh yes, that's the good stuff, and everyone else just like, oh. But I don't know. I thought that was funny too, because it is funny. Then there's this other funny moment where like Saul's like brash oath and him just kind of saying whatever he wants ends up making other people commit sin. See, this is why the Bible tells you don't just make rash oaths. Don't do it, right? I mean, we've read in the book of Judges this happens a few times. I think the book of Numbers hasn't happened. I think Exodus hasn't happened at least once. Genesis obviously hasn't happened a couple of times. When these people just make like these rash oaths, right? Like these like crazy promises that like, well, they're not promises, right? They're there's like, we won't do this until this happens or whatever, right? Or I won't rest until this happens, right? Or whatever. It's like, no, this is not a good idea. just be rational, just take it step by step, guy. Like, don't do these crazy extremes, right? Because like, as the one that comes to recent memory, because it was in a more recent reading, but like if we recall in the book of Judges, there was that guy who like made an oath and he would like sacrifice the person that came out of his house. Like, what kind of oath is that, first of all? And secondly, it's like, this is not gonna, you just know it's gonna end up real badly, right? And then his like young daughter comes out and is just like, well, gotta sacrifice. It's like, no one even asked you to do like a sacrifice in the first place, right? And then here, like Saul does the same thing. Like no one asked you, like no one asked him to like, oh yeah, make an oath and make your people starve before before you acquire victory. No one ever asked him to do it, and yet here Saul's just like, I'll just do whatever I want, right? I won't rest until this happens, blah blah blah, blah, right? And it just makes Saul look stupid, right? And on top of that, not only does it make him look stupid, it makes other people do wrong things because, you think of there's that part where, um, starting from verse 31. So after the Israelites do defeat the Philistines at Mic- Michmash, and they're like, "Oh, we can finally eat," right? Well, they're so hungry they'll just eat the first thing that they see, right? And they just take the animal, kill it, and eat it raw, right? They don't care. They're not gonna wait for it to cook, right? They're just gonna eat it straight because, like, all they think is, "I gotta eat," right? Because I'm starving, right? That's what they're thinking, and you know, I'm empathetic toward these guys, sinning as they're eating the meat with the blood in it still, because like, yeah, that's what happens when you starve people, right? And so, it just Saul just looks worse, right? His his power trip and his, you know, saying whatever he wants to say and making rash oaths, it not only makes him look stupid, but it makes people do wrong things. And we can easily think of some examples today where stuff like that has happened, right? Some people will say certain things and it will lead people to do stupid ass things like this, right? And it's all the more reason why the Bible uses patience as a virtue, right? How important being patient is, right? Of course, ultimately, the Bible tells us to be patient, you know, in regards to how we view our prayers with God and all that. But I mean, and how we relate to God and being, patient when God does things in His time. And sure, that's annoying, but at the same time, one, it's it's definitely true, right? God does things in His time, and you have to wait for it, right? You can't decide when God does something. But at the same time, there's also that practical level of being patient will always keep you out of trouble more often than it doesn't, right? And that's another thing the Bible plays over and over, right? When you're patient, then God will let things play out favorably. When you're not patient, things end up going very badly, right? Like it even goes as far back as Adam and Eve, right? When they encountered the serpent, right? They could have been patient. They could have waited instead of like letting the serpent goad them. Did God really say? They could have been like, hey, we could just ask God when He gets here. I mean, He is coming over later today, right? Or you think of Abraham and the promised son, right? Sarah decided not to be patient, even though once again it's easy to justify her reasoning because like, oh, she's super old. What's this? She can't have kids, so don't be patient with God, right? And so you know, Sarah ends up causing a lot of problems because of her impatience, right? Rachel ends up causing a lot of problems because of her impatience, right? And so, I mean, Moses causes. I mean, I skipped this part of the book of. Well, it wasn't in the book of Exodus. It actually happens in the book of Numbers, but Moses causes problems for the Israelites because he's impatient, right? The Israelites cause problems for Moses because they're impatient, right? And so being impatient clearly is a bad thing because it always causes problems for other people, right? And so Saul also does this for his army, right? His his impatience and his rash oath cause the people to be impatient, and then because they're impatient and they can't wait for food to cook and for animal blood to be drawn out, they eat the blood of the animal when they're even though they're told not to, because impatience, right, makes you do stupid things and it makes you do all the wrong things, right? And it's easy to see that in our lives today, right? If you just grab the first thing, if you don't wait for better options when it comes to life decisions, you end up making big dumbass mistakes, and that's just the way it is when we are not patient, right? And that's all the more reason why the Bible is so adamant about like how patience is a virtue, right? And it's a very important one. So, moral of the story is, don't get high on power trips. It makes you impatient. It makes other people impatient. It makes people do stupid things, right? But when Saul is already so far gone, this actually kind of shows you he's actually pretty far gone in how like corrupt he's become because he's just so drunk with power. Right? But then, of course, the story has this little piece of hope where like the people defend Jonathan, right? Because Saul is actually ready to kill his own son because like, oh, you broke the oath that you didn't hear, and you caused problems for all of us. And of course, this also kind of shows Saul as being kind of a jerk, right? That he doesn't just own up to his own mistakes, right? Saying that like, Saul could have the wise thing he could have done, right? The repentant thing he could have done was been like, ah, I did something really stupid, right? I led my people to sin. I made us all fall short before God, and that's on me, right? Saul could have done that. That would have been the right thing to have done. But he doesn't do it, right? He blames his son to the point that his son deserves death. What kind of like real dad of the year here, right? He he points out like, Jonathan, this is your fault, right? It wasn't my fault for making the people impatient and do stupid things. It's your fault because you did something stupid. Which is, I mean, really idiotic logic, but you know, Saul's kind of power trip in here, right? Oh, I'm the king. I can't do wrong, right? Which is another reason why, you know, only God can be king, because human kings tend to get drunk with this kind of power of thinking, well, I can't do wrong, right? Think of, you know, a certain former president is a good example of that, right? Like I'm the leader. I can't do wrong. No, you can't think that, right? But that's exactly what happens here, right? Saul is so drunk with power that he thinks he can't do wrong, so he blames his son Jonathan, right? That like, oh, you did something stupid, and that's why everything is going wrong today. Instead of owning up to his own mistake, right, and saying that like I made the people impatient. I led us all to debauchery with the meat and all that, right? Because I was not wise, right? Saul could have owned up to it, but he doesn't. And so here now, but the people were, willing to save Jonathan, say like, no, Jonathan has done something great, and because of that, we can't punish him, right? And then Saul relents to the people, and he's like, all right, fine, right? And so Jonathan gets to live because the men rescued him. Then the rest of the chapter just talks about how like Saul lived his life as a king. He fought the enemies and did good by the people, which is funny after this moment where we talk about Saul power tripping and being a bad king. The Bible reminds us that like, well, Saul wasn't all bad, right? He still defended the people. And one thing that's interesting, that some people may think this is kind of extra detail in the Bible, but if you actually read the entirety of the book of Samuel, the last set of verses in chapter 14 from 49 to 52, which kind of talks about Saul's family, is actually an interesting little bit of text. Now, this could be skipping a bit ahead if you don't know the story of the book of Samuel. David, his major problem is that like David, how does Mary put it in the Big Bang Theory? She makes a joke about it in this one episode of the Big Bang Theory, in regards to Penny. And then, because Mary's that like super religious person, right? Big Bang Theory, Mary, Sheldon's mom. And there's a part when they're in the Catholic church exhibit thing, and she's like, how's the joke go? So Mary basically says about Penny, giving a prayer for Penny kind of thing. She's like, Lord, you might want to have that talk with Penny like you had with Mary Magdalene. She takes a little bit too far with the love thy neighbor. And, you know, the kind of poking at Penny being kind of, you know, sexually loose. And David is like that, right? He's a little bit too passionate. That's what I mean when he, you know, he's a little bit too passionate. You know, David's a bit of a womanizer. And I mean, to be fair though, when you're that good looking and can kick some major ass, then yeah, you know, it's no surprise women flock to a guy like David, but that doesn't mean he has the right to just have all the wives he does. But basically, the problem David has is that, you know, he's too passionate and stuff like that, and so that ends up to all kinds of problems, right? Because with polygamy and all the different kids, and then there's other problems when you have kids with all these women and all that stuff, and that will be somewhere later in the year when we finally get there. But basically, David's whole problem is that, you know, he's can't keep his plunger in his pants, so that causes all kind of problems for Israel. With that being said, though, I think this little bit about Saul's family is actually kind of interesting because, you know, chapter 14, after talking about how stupid Saul is at times, the Bible still wanted to give you that little bit of glimmer of hope, right? That there were parts of Saul that was good, right? And one, he fought Israel's enemies faithfully as Israel's king, like Israel wanted, that God had set him to do, right? He was doing the job that God gave him to do. So he was good in that sense. He was also kind of a good king because he is actually a man of one wife. You know, he has a good family. And minus his whole incident with his son, he actually shows that he cares for them later in the story, right? When Saul's older, and maybe this whole thing with Jonathan taught him a lesson on how to treat his kids better. Whereas, of course, when we read David, David's part of the story, David sucks as a dad, right? He sucks as a dad. He sucks as a husband to all his wives, right? He's terrible, right? He's a terrible family man, right? Whereas Saul, that's like probably one of his only good traits, really. Saul is actually a decent family man. That's probably one of his good traits, though. But once again, even though that's true, you still have to keep the main theme in mind that only God can be king. And just because you're a good family man doesn't make you a good king. Just because, you know, you love and trust God doesn't automatically make you a good leader, right? There's more to it than that. But of course, when you actually break it down, only God can be king, because only he can fulfill all the things a king must do, right? For the people and for society as a whole, right? Only God can do that. But the Bible, with that being true, the Bible still doesn't paint all the human leaders as all terrible, right? Because we still need them, right? So you should always look for the things that the human leaders can do right. And so the end of chapter 14 kind of does that. It kind of tells it like, well, Saul was, you know, Saul may have been, you know, he can be an arrogant prick, but Saul still gets the job done, and he's a decent family man, which is kind of what chapter 14 gives us at the end here. Okay, so I'm going to read one more chapter, because I think this chapter 15 ends the Saul arc, or the King Saul arc, kind of, because, I mean, Saul's still going to be king for a bunch of chapters, but he's the focus on him being a bad king. I mean, sure, it pops up here and there through the rest of 1 Samuel, but it's not like the focus of 1 Samuel now, right? Well, chapter 15 will be the climax, if you will, of this idea that, you know, the surface story of the book of Samuel First and Second Samuel is a tale of two bad kings, right? First Samuel, tale of one bad king. Second Samuel, tale of second bad king, right? But of course, the book of Samuel, the whole idea is only God can be king, right? Anyway, I know I keep repeating that point because I want you to get that point. But chapter 15 is kind of the climax of like, this is how bad it gets for Saul. That Saul is not fit to be king. Because once again, no human can be fit to be king. Only God can be king. So, chapter 15 is the climax of seeing how this is how bad king number 1 ultimately fails. And a reminder that no human being can be king. Chapter 15. By the way, we're going to end the stream after chapter 15. If you have any questions or stuff like that, just shoot them in the comments/chat. I know most of you guys watch this after I do the streams, but if you guys have questions, you can always ask me. I'm easy enough to find. I do have like the Discord thing in the description, which is the best way to contact me, by the way. Just because, like, I don't know, I spend way too much time on Discord, honestly. But I think Discord is just really easy to use. Easy to use? What do you mean it's easy to use? Anyway, let's move on. Chapter 15 will be the last chapter. That's kind of what I'm getting at for today. Because I think it's a good place to stop too, right? Because starting from chapter 16, we kind of move to a different direction in what the book of Samuel is kind of telling us, right? Anyway, chapter 15. So Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people, Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, cattle, sheep, camels, donkeys. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Now Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, Go away, leave the Amalekites, so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all the people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep, cattle, the fat calves, and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. So early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul. But he was told that Saul had gone to Carmel. There he set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. When Samuel reached them, Saul said, The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instruction. But Samuel said, What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul answered, The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But we totally destroyed the rest. I love how it says it that way. We totally destroyed the rest. Enough, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. So Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of all the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people. The Amalekites wage war against them until you wipe them out. Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?' 'But I did obey the Lord,' Saul said. 'I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag and their king.'" Clearly, your definition and my definition of completely destroy are two different things. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instruction. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Sorry for that cough in the background. My microphone is really sensitive, so it actually picked that up. It is not me, by the way. My dad just came home and he's making all this noise. Anyway, as verse 27. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe and tore the hem of the robe. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has turned the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being, that he should change his mind." But Saul replied, "I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag." Sorry, wrong voice. "Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, "Well, surely the bitterness of death is past." But Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among them." And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Yeah, chapter 15, pretty hardcore, right? So let's break it down. So the chapter is basically about how Saul ultimately kind of gets so power drunk that he just openly defies God. And he's just like, "You know what? I think I know better than you. I'm just going to do this my way as opposed to your way and just do whatever I want." Right? That's kind of fundamentally what happens. And that's why God ultimately rejects him. And even says to Samuel, that he regrets making Saul king. And so what happens here is that basically first God's like, play the Dimitri meme, kill every last one of them moment, right? Because God had decided, okay, the Amalekites, they did evil toward my people, and the subtext is that they never bothered to change, right? Because the Amalekites not only hated Israel in the past, but they were still a problem to that day, right? Now I make this caveat because I know some people would read this and say like, well, why would God command the Israelites to completely annihilate another people group? Doesn't God have compassion on other people groups? It's not like Israel is his only people. Well, once again, one of the problems of reading text in general is that, you don't get to see every single side, right? So what we don't see is that God may have given the Amalekites chances to repent. But in the grand scheme of things, it appears that doesn't matter because what the Bible shows us is the result of that, assuming that happened, right? If God had given the Amalekites chances to repent, well, we know the choice they made by their continual war against Israel, and that was no, we're not going to change. We're going to keep fighting Israel, right? And so God's like, all right, fine. If that's your final decision, then you're done, right? And so God commands Saul to kill every last one of them. And so Saul is supposed to do this, but he doesn't, right? First, he takes the king prisoner. Automatic red flag, right? Because he's already broken the commandment. That's not kill every last one of them, right? So Saul takes the king prisoner. And then of course he lets his men take the good cattle for themselves as like food and stuff like that, as opposed to killing them like God told him to, right? And as I coyly joked about how like I guess your definition and my definition of completely destroy are two different things, right? Because Saul doesn't do it. And then because when God sees this, he's like, what the hell, man? Like, you didn't do what I told you to do, right? I told you to destroy them all. What part of destroy them all was unclear? And so God tells Samuel this, and Samuel's like, oh my gosh, like I have to deal with this now. And so Samuel goes and meets Saul, and Saul's acting like I call it chipper, right? And the funny thing is that like the Bible even points out that like Saul's pretty power drunk, where like he builds a monument for himself, he's doing all the priestly rites, like he did in chapter 14, breaking, or sorry, chapter 13, breaking his boundaries, right? Going beyond his boundaries as a king and as a governor of Israel, right? He's definitely out, he's definitely gone beyond his boundaries. And so, Saul's just kind of like, he treats it like it's a pretty regular thing that he just does whatever he wants, right? Because he's become so arrogant with his power. And God's not happy with that. And he's like, no, you were supposed to respect me at all times, right? You don't think that just because I gave you power, you get to do whatever you want with it, right? And so God's like, well, since you think since you think this way, I'm going to take that from you, right? But of course, God doesn't just like immediately strike him dead or anything. God says, well, I'm just going to give it to someone else then, right? You're going to grow, you will grow old and die. And then when you're gone, someone else will, not in your family will be king, right? That you just got to deal with it, right? And so God says, your reign is basically over. I will take someone else to be king over Israel. And you have to be okay with that. And so Saul, of course, like when he hears this, he realizes too little, too late, though, that like, he has disobeyed God and he has failed before God. And so that's that's what happens. And on the one hand, you feel a little bit sorry for Saul because like, I mean, that's pretty harsh for God to do that. And it's an easy argument to make that. But at the same time, like once again, it's the problem of time spans and stuff. Like, we read this in like 3 chapters, but this is like something that happens for years, like a long process for Saul. And so maybe if we had seen like the slow burn of like his corruption, maybe we wouldn't be as sympathetic. But at the same time, once again, the Bible is not preoccupied with that, right? The Bible is pointing out that like only God can be king, right? Because human beings will never truly fulfill, what needs to be done, right? And so Saul fails to kill all the Amalekites. And not that he fails because of inability, he fails because he decides not to do it, right? Because that's, he spares the king of Agag. Speaking of sparing the king of Agag, though, I think Samuel's statement to him is like the most badass thing you could say. It's just like, just as you have made so many uh, women childless. Yeah, he says, just as you have made women childless, your mother is going to be among them, and just slaughters them after. That's pretty bad. That's like the best. Like I just picture it in my head where like you think of like a '90s action movie where like '90s action movies are typical like guys just throwing like kind of cheesy one-liners as they like land some awesome killing blow on somebody, right? I mean, Die Hard has a good one, but I'm not gonna say it here. You know, yippee ki yay, you fill in the rest, and he just shoots the guy in the head, right? Like, yeah, I imagine something just like that, right? That Samuel does here. He says, this awesome one-liner, and then just stabs the guy to death or whatever, right? Like, it's a, it's. I think the line is pretty badass, though. Not gonna lie, I think it's pretty good. I mean, there's one reason why I think Samuel's just awesome, just because, like a '90s action hero, he knows how to throw a good one-liner. But anyway, going back with Saul and not dealing with the Amalekites, it really shows that like Saul has also become pretty arrogant and thinking that like, well, I know better. I know how to do things, right? Because it's pretty easy to come up with like justifications of why Saul would have done what he did, right? Why he would disobey God from like a diplomatic sense and also like feeding his troops, right? Because you think of like, okay, sparing the king Agag would be like, it would make him more powerful on a diplomatic level, right? It would be like, it would instill fear in other nations because like, man, like Saul is tough, right? He he has taken ownership of the king of another nation, right? He basically has shown that he truly rules over them. And then of course, like by sparing the animals, even though God told Saul to kill them too. But Saul's like, well, I could give it to my men, and we can also use it for burnt sacrifice, right? But of course, Samuel points out, it's like, no, listening to God is the most important thing, right? Not things like sacrifices and offerings, which Jesus later says something very similar, right? God wants love and obedience over tradition, right? And it's one of those things that so many people are quick to point out which is wrong with the church, and there's merit to it. Where like, oh, so many Christians are in love with the traditions more than about loving people, which is which is half true, right? There are a lot of churches that are too caught up in like the system to, actually help and care for people. I hate to say it, but it's true. But of course, at the same time, like there are many churches that obviously show God's love to like their communities and stuff, and so it's not a it's only half true when people talk about like churches being too in love with their traditions. But what does this have to do with First Samuel? Well, that's one of the things that God really gets mad about, right? That we get too caught up in traditions versus actually obeying God, right? And it is something that has poisoned the church, to the present day, right? It's just kind of something that churches have to deal with now. We're kind of stuck in this rock and hard place predicament now, right? But that was Saul's real failing, right? That he did not obey God, right? And I mean that's kind of the most important thing, right? Because once again, what's the whole point of a king? Is that the people listen to, swear loyalty, and thus follow and obey their king, right? And so God is trying to give a reminder of like, no, ultimately, you know, I am king. That's basically what God is saying, right? Ultimately. And so if you, the earthly human leader for my people, cannot get that straight, right? You're supposed to be the example. And that's something that like why it's such a big deal when like Christian leaders are caught in scandals or stuff like that, right? Because, the Christian leader is supposed to be the example of that, right? And so the Christian leader is supposed to live as if like, yeah, God is king, right? Because then when you have to say that God is king, right? People will take you seriously if you actually live like it matters, right? And that's something that God couldn't have Saul do, right? Because Saul wasn't doing it. Saul was not living as if God was king. And if Saul wasn't going to live that way, then he is unfit to lead the people of Israel. And that's why God ultimately rejects him as being king. So yeah, that's chapter 15 in a nutshell, right? That basically Saul has this massive moral failing. He fails to recognize God as king, ultimately, right? Because a lot of that is that power corruption that got to his head about like him being king, right? And failed to remember that ultimately God is king and doesn't live his life that way. And that won't work, right? Because if the leader of Israel doesn't act like God is king, well, then nobody's going to act like God is king. And then you run into other bigger problems, right? And I mentioned this earlier when it comes to like, this isn't just true with Israel, but it's true with any nation, right? If if our leaders don't act with a fear of God and act like God is king, then why would the people do it? And if the people don't do it, then, well, anarchy ensues, right? Of course, this is where you get a lot of divides, right? Like, oh, whether it's more on the individual, like, well, me being a Christian is good enough. But then at the same time, we should also pray for and expect, godly leadership, because if you don't have that, then that would also demotivate even Christians to be godly, right? And I've made a hot take on that one, right? Why do you think things like, you know, intersectional feminism has poisoned the church for so long? Well, when you don't have godly leaders in secular culture, right, stuff like that will poison the church, because as secular governments make those things more normalized, or not just normalized, but say like, no, this is the right way, right? Even though it goes against what Scripture says, well, Christians will end up buying into it, and then that creates problems, right? And that's the real reason why many churches are dying too, right? Because, well, I mean, it's across the board though, right? It's what happens when you don't have, leaders, government leaders that are, you know, following God as their king, because then the people won't do it, right? And so that's what we see in Saul, right? Saul is, and that's why God's like, I can't have you be king, because if you're not going to live, you know, with God as king, no one else will, and that will be the end of society. That will be the end of Israel, right? And that is true with any culture today, right? If God is not viewed as king, if the leaders don't follow God as king, no one's going to do it, and that will be the end of society. That's just kind of how it is. But, there's that glimmer of hope in this story at the end of chapter 15, right? Because even though Saul did these awful things, and he's failed as king now, and it's spelled out why he's failed as king. Samuel points out, well, God will choose someone else, right? And so we'll see how that plays out. Now, of course, as I've already said, even though, David is a bad king by his own reasons, many people are willing to give some of the bad things he does a pass because he at least gets this part. David at least gets this part right, right? That he has to live as if God is king. And so I will go into a lot more detail of how they contrast in different aspects of bad kings as I go through David's story, which won't be for like at least a month because we got to get to 2 Samuel before you start seeing this, right? And I mean, it takes like I've already been doing this for a month, and we're only like chapter 15. So let's say 2 months. So maybe you'll have to watch this video again by the time I get there, or watch this part of it anyway. But what's important here to understand with like Saul's failing and why some people are quick to say Saul is worse of the two, which you can make a sound argument, is that this is a bigger crime, right? Saul's wrongdoing is it's a lot worse because of how it affects society on a grand scale, right? And I had a funny comparison I might make. We'll see if I still make it because it is a major hot take when I get to it. But when I get to talk about David as a king, you'll kind of see like this is like at least David gets this part right. So that's why some people are willing to give David a pass, even though he himself is a bad king as well. But people are willing to give David a pass because he doesn't fail in this regard, which is which you can make the argument, and by the transient of my own logic, I would agree that like since David at least follows this part, like obeying God as if he was king, David gets a bit of a pass, or at the very least he's not worse than Saul, right? Because that's why Saul is viewed as being so bad, right? Because he fails in this fundamental thing about leadership as well as worship of God, right? He fails in this fundamental thing, right? Whereas David's failing is more like details, right? And I mean, to be fair, those are major failings in their own right. But I think this thing here with chapter 15 is really important to study. And why it's so important to study is because, there are larger ramifications, right? And we'll see that be played down the line as we continue through the book of Samuel and, other future books. If you read through the book of Kings, you definitely see, this kind of thing happen. The kind of behavior that Saul has and other people, of course, that ends up being really detrimental, right, to society as a whole. And so that's, I think, is the real reason why God rejects Saul and even goes so far to say, like, man, I regret making Saul a king, which is a pretty bold statement, especially for God, right? Because, I mean, when humans regret something, it's already a big deal. If God regrets something, well, that's a major deal, right? So, something to really consider. Anyway, I hear some funky things upstairs. Talk about needing to go get dinner. So, with that said, I'll just do a bit of housekeeping before we end the stream today. So, I know today was longer, but I had to do a bit of a makeup for last week because I didn't stream last week. Next week, we'll do regular schedules. So, right now, I'm still playing StarCraft 2. I'm in the Protoss campaign / expansion pack when they sold it originally. Legacy of the Void. So, that will be on Monday and Wednesdays. At Monday and Wednesday at 2 p.m. Pacific time. So that would be 5 o'clock Eastern. And then next Thursday, we have a Throwback Thursday where I'm still playing Heroes of Might and Magic 2, and I will be playing that for a while, probably for like the rest of the year, considering my current pace of playing Heroes 2. But, I mean, it's fun to play, so I hope you guys check that one out. And of course, next Friday, we will jump into 1 Samuel chapter 16 and this new direction that the story takes. And so I hope you guys are looking forward to that. With that said, though, this is going to be the end of the stream. Hope you guys had a good time. I hope you guys learned something. And, always remember that we put God first. With that being said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And I will see you next week for StarCraft streams and more Bible reading. God bless you.